get some of your background and your early career before you came an author and build a picture for the listeners, I think.
Yes. Well, my interest in engineering and science really began at the age of 8 when I used to keep pigeons in Manchester where I grew up. And I couldn't figure out how the pigeons found their way home. And I remember when I used to let them go, they used to fly up into the air, circle once or twice, and then zigzag all the way home to Manchester. And I was fascinated as to how this, what they were sensing, what they were actually doing. And I had to wait until I was 20 years old, and I went to sea as a radio officer on board ship. And I was standing in the wheelhouse one day in a storm off the coast of France, watching the steering gear and the gyro compass. And I was looking at the course the ship was plotting. And every time a large wave hit the bow, it knocked us off course. Then the gyro compass would sense the magnetic error and send a signal to the rudder, and the rudder was bringing us back onto course, so that the ship steered a zigzag course. And so it occurred to me then that the pigeons who flew in a zigzag must be finding or sensing this magnetic deviation and then error correcting to get back on course. And that got me very interested in magnetism, how it affected the human brain and the body, and how the sun and the sunspot cycle affected humans on Earth. About the same time, I was interested in psychology and all kinds of things from ESP to, all the paranormal type of sciences. And I decided to investigate psychology and how the brain worked and how magnetism affected the brain and how sunspots might be instrumental in creating the 12 types of personality that we see in astrology, sun sign astrology. So I went to college for 3 years in Manchester Navy College, and I finished off at Plymouth University doing electrical and communications engineering. And I went to sea as a radio officer, and I was at sea for about 12 years, traveling the world. And I noticed that when we went to South Africa, and it was very difficult to communicate on shortwave to the UK, that the sunspot cycle was interfering with communications very badly. I also noticed that when the ship was sailing from north to south, the ship's personnel were quite happy. But when the ship started sailing from east to west, they became very anxious and fractious and started arguing. Now, the only thing that changes when we go from east to west is the Earth's magnetic field. So again, this stimulated the questions I had regarding astrology and psychology. The first trip I went on finished up in China, and it was there I went around the marketplaces and the temples and talking to all kinds of people. And it was I then learned about Chinese astrology, the 12-year cycle, in addition to the 12-monthly cycle of Western astrology. So once I started to bring all these facts together, I began to realize that clearly the 11.5-year sunspot cycle must be related in some way to the 12-year Chinese personality cycle, the astrological zodiac, and that the 12 personalities of our own zodiac must be related to some kind of variation in solar output every year. And so I decided to sit down and figure out how astrology works. And I figured that out in 1986. And that was after several years, probably 10 years of investigations into the sun and how it affects life on Earth. Now, most people don't appreciate or don't know that the sun actually spins on its axis, just like the Earth does. The sun takes 28 days to spin once. That is, the equatorial region of the sun takes 28 days in relation to the moving Earth, if you were measuring it from the moving Earth. The sun is actually a ball of plasma, and it moves at a different rate from the North Pole to the equator to the South Pole. And this is known as a differential rotation of the sun. And this is caused by the planet Mercury, I later discovered on my own. Mercury moves 4.1 degrees a day as it orbits the sun, and this drags the equatorial plasma around 4.1 degrees a day faster than the polar regions of the sun. So this creates a turbulence on the sun, like a paddle, which stirs up particles inside the sun. And these particles come out of the sun, positive and negative particles come out of the sun, and the polarity changes every 7 days. So as the sun spins, it showers off 7 days of positive particles, then it showers off 7 days of negative particles, then it showers off 7 days of positive particles again, and then again 7 days of negative. And this 28-day period corresponds to the human biorhythm, which is well known, and it was discovered by others, Swiss scientists in the 1960s and 70s. What I discovered was it also regulates the human female menstrual cycle. So that every time the sun spins, females menstruate in accordance with the radiation coming from the sun. Now, of course, this raises several questions. One of them, for example, is why don't all females menstruate at the same time? Well, this is because the biorhythms of each female starts and stops at different times, and it all depends when they got onto the earth, when they were conceived in the womb, if you like. So I call it asynchronous synchronization, and this is explained in Future Science. So, excuse me, it was a long journey which began with fundamental questions about psychology, solar radiation, that finished up into a journey which went into the scientific side of bioregulation and fertility, hormone regulation, and personality determination. I discovered that this radiation shuffles at the genes at the moment of conception, and this causes 12 types of personality because there are 12 types of radiation every year. And then from that side, it was quite a coincidence, really, because I was walking down. Oh no, I've missed a step out. I was then working at Cranfield University from 1989 as head of electrical and communications engineering. And I looked after the electrical and communications infrastructure of the university. It was not on the academic side, it was on the management side. And one of the jobs I had to do was working with the computer center, which had one of the biggest computers in the world at that time, a batch of DEC computers. And I was trying to figure out the duration of a long-term sunspot cycle. I'd calculated the 28-day one clearly. We can observe the sunspots on the sun. They appear as dark regions of the sun. Most people think they're actually cooler regions, but they're not actually cooler regions. They're just periods of intense magnetic activity. And when light passes through them, the light is diverted, it's deflected 90 degrees. So no light comes out of the sunspot holes. They're no colder. It's just that the light doesn't get through them. So I tried to figure out a way of calculating how long this sunspot cycle takes. Now, conventional wisdom said it could not be calculated for three reasons. One, because the sun has two magnetic fields, one on the equator and one on the polar caps. And these two fields rotate at different rates. So it's difficult to describe the position of either of those fields in relation to the Earth. For example, we might say, well, the polar field this week is 90 degrees from the Earth, and the equatorial field is in line with the Earth. But a week later, the polar field might be 20 degrees, and the Earth might be 6 degrees. So you've got two variables. And because of this, and because the Earth is moving, the conventional wisdom of science is that the sunspot cycle cannot be calculated. But there is a way of calculating it, which I figured out using a method I determined as differential rotation of the sun's two polar fields. We can do it by calculating the crossover of the two magnetic fields and differentiating one with respect to the other. That means finding the difference between them, and then finding the difference between that common field, or the aggregate field, and the Earth. And what I found was that there's a cycle of 11.49299 years. Then I realized, once I put these into the Cranfield computer, that there's actually another cycle which takes 187 years to go through its complete changes. So once I'd figured the duration out on the Cranfield computer for 187 years, now, these numbers may sound a little bit complicated, but they're not really. It's just that the numbers are very important, as I'll explain in a second. So this 187-year cycle is actually 68,302 days. It's quite exact. But this mixes with the 11-year cycle to produce an 18,000-year cycle, which changes its direction 5 times during the cycle. In other words, the sun's magnetic field changes 5 times every 18,139 years. Now, what that means is that every 1,366,040 days, that's every 3,740 years, the direction of the sun's magnetic field changes. Now, curiously, the coincidence I found was this. The ancient Mayas in Mexico, who disappeared in around AD 750, that's 1,250 years ago, they worshipped that number as a magic number. The question which raises the question of how could a so-called primitive civilization who worshipped the sun as the god of astrology and the god of fertility, how could they have known this 1,250 years ago before the computer was developed? So this set me on a search of ancient civilizations, in particular those that worship the sun, the Mayas of Mexico, the Incas of Peru, the Egyptians of around the age of Tutankhamun, the ancient Chinese of around 200 BC, and of course the Celtic people that migrated from Eastern Europe and Scythia and Egypt around about commencing about 5,000 BC and finishing up about 800 AD. So this investigation of ancient sun-worshipping civilizations then allowed me to understand all other kinds of things about science and physics, and that they obviously possessed a higher awareness of science, solar science, and not only that, but spirituality. They understood what God is, why we live, why we die, why this has to be. They explained in their treasures, they left all this information encoded in their treasures for later civilizations like ourselves to discover for ourselves. So, for example, the Mayas encoded all of this information about the sun, the solar science, and about God in their architecture, their calendrical numbering systems, in their jewelry, in their carvings, in every aspect of their existence. They left it behind for us to discover at a later date. Now, one of the questions many people ask is, well, why did they encode it? Why didn't they just carve it down? And there's two answers to this, because the first thing is you can't just write it down, because they were aware that sunspot cycles not only affect personality and fertility, but every time the sun's magnetic field changes every 3,740 years, the magnetic field that showers the Earth switches direction, and it can cause the planets to tilt on their axis. And it did do this in 3113 BC. The sun's magnetic field changed, and the planet Venus turned upside down on its axis. This is why Venus now rotates backwards to all of the other planets, and it's slowing down its rate of axial spin. So they knew that if they wrote it down in their own language of the Quiche Maya, nobody would understand it in thousands of years to come. So they had to write it down in a way that would be preserved, and that any language, somebody speaking any language would understand it. Now, there's two languages that everybody subscribes to in the world. One is the language of pictures. In other words, if we see a picture, we all know what it means. The other one is a numerical system where we use the base 10 because we have 10 fingers. Now, some people say the Mayas used the base 20, but they didn't. They actually used the base 10. So they encoded the information to survive catastrophic destruction caused by pole tilting events. And they also realized that when the sun's magnetic field changes in such a big way every 3,740 years, that there would be no fertility, because the menstrual cycle of females would stop. So there would be no babies born. They also knew that every 3,740 years, when the sun is active and sends out more radiation, more X-rays strike the Earth around the equator than they do around the polar regions like the UK and South Africa. So a lot of the X-rays cause spontaneous fetal abortion in early impregnated females around in the equatorial regions, especially around Mexico. So it was important to them. So they had a triple whammy. And they also realized that during a sunspot minimum, that more water evaporates less water evaporates from the oceans, which means that there's less water in cloud formations, less rain, and so they experience a drought and crop failure. So all of this solar science was very important to these sun-worshipping Maya. They knew about the fertility, decline in fertility. They knew about the the increased miscarriages due to X-rays. They knew about the possible pole tilting, which doesn't happen every time. It depends on the strength of the field. And so they had to, they felt they had a duty to write it down, not just for other people, but what we find in their treasures is that they believed in reincarnation. And they explained how reincarnation works, what God is, what heaven is, what hell is, why we're born, why we die, and why this has to be. And because they were acutely aware of reincarnation, it was a good idea because they knew. For example, the Egyptians tell us that when they died, they preserved the internal organs of dead people, they mummified them, and they put the liver, the intestines and the lungs in canopic jars where they preserved them, but they took great pains to explain that they did not preserve the heart or the brain. And what the Egyptians were trying to tell us around the time of Tutankhamun, about 1315 BC, was that when we come back and reincarnate, we have a new heart and a new brain with a new memory. So we remember nothing of the past, not emotionally or intellectually. So they wanted to write the information for themselves just in case they didn't get to heaven. So if they didn't get to heaven, they could pick up where they left off once they'd decoded all this information and get to heaven easier the next time around. So this took me on to a different level of understanding, and this, what I'm referring to now is that they understood that God was light, electromagnetic energy, which is what the Bible says. The Bible actually says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So in the Bible, light came second to the Word of God, if you like. If you look in the Hindu Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, it says God is light. It's quite explicit. God is electromagnetic energy. God is voltage. It's as simple as that. And God is in every human being. God is a battery in our heart. And once the battery goes dead, we die. Now, of course, the battery doesn't go dead usually, and that's because of the way a human being is developed in the womb. What happens is, in the physical dimension, is that a sperm enters the egg, and the cells divide, and the cells become chromosomes, and systems develop, like nerves and muscles and things like that. And the systems, after a few weeks in the womb, start to develop pathways and start to develop voltages of their own. Now, these voltages are opposite to the voltage which comes from God. Now, I'll just step back a minute, because in the beginning, God was light and God was good, and the only thing better than God, presumably, is more God, because God is love. This is what the Bible teaches us in the religious books all around the world. And we're told that God created man in his own image. Now, God can do anything. Well, mankind can do almost anything, but what mankind cannot do is to reproduce itself without sacrifice. In other words, in order to reproduce, a human being must throw away a sperm or an egg, an ovum, and then the two come together. And in the beginning, God wanted to grow, but because he made us in his own image, and we know we can't grow, the inference, therefore, is that God can do anything except grow. So God wanted to grow because it was a good thing, because God is love, love is good, so the only thing better than God is more God. So in the beginning, God sacrificed a piece of himself in order to grow. Now, in other words, let's say God was 1,000,000 volts to begin with. He threw away 100,000 volts, as simple as that, to create the physical universe. And this physical universe, through the Big Bang, turned into the planets, stars, and everything we see around us. And this is described by Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Now, if God is 1,000,000 volts on the left-hand side of this equation, the equation is actually quite revealing. It reveals something even Einstein didn't know. It reveals that if God is 1,000,000 volts and he throws away 100,000 volts, then if it goes to the other side of Einstein's equation to become mass, then it must change its sign, its algebraic sign. So if God is plus 1,000,000, the 100,000 volts which crosses the equation of Einstein must become minus 100,000. Then we get the Big Bang, and the Big Bang turns into the physical universe. Now, what we see once we analyze this now is that if God is positive on the left-hand side of the equation, 900,000, on the right-hand side we have the negative universe. What we find is if God lives in heaven, which is positive, then the universe, which is negative, must be the opposite of God. So the universe must be the devil. So this tells us that God sacrificed 100,000 volts. The 100,000 volts went to the other side of Einstein's equation, became negative, the opposite of God, and in so doing created the Big Bang, which created hell. Excuse me. So this is the beginning. This is how it all started off. Then on the planets, evolution kicks in, and we get the planets start to form. Gravity brings together the dust that was created after the Big Bang, and after thousands and millions of years, the dust accretes into boulders and rocks and planets, and the stars begin to burn through nuclear fusion. And the planets develop magnetic fields and start to rotate on their axis. Once they start to spin on their axis, the core becomes hotter and hotter through gravitational heating over millions of years. And then the planets start to orbit the sun. So the solar systems begin around the stars. Then night and day begin, so time begins. So now we have time, because before that, nothing ever happened, so there was no time. Nothing happened before anything else, nothing happened after anything else. But once the planets were formed and they started to spin on their axis and orbit the sun, that's when we get time, and evolution begins. Then we get the oceans developing on the Earth, and the first single-celled creatures are created from the nucleic acids on the Earth. There are theories that these first nucleic acids may have been brought from other planets, or from outer space, but clearly they started somewhere, so we can assume that the starting place was here for the purposes of analysis. So then we get evolution, and the first single-celled creatures like amoeba turn into the more complicated Spirogyra, that turns into the jellyfish and sponges and bivalve mollusks and things like that. And eventually, after millions of years, human beings are developed. Then, as a sperm enters the egg in the human being, what happens is we have to remember that that lump of meat with the human being in the womb, that lump of meat is negative because it's in the universe, which is hell, don't forget. This universe is hell. But once it creates its own voltages, as the blood starts to pump around the heart and the nervous system begins to develop voltages, and the voltages start to fire up the computer in a human brain, the brain starts to operate, then the baby itself develops a voltage of minus 5 volts, for example. Now, once that starts to happen after a few weeks in the womb, it's difficult to say when. I've witnessed babies being reincarnated, but it seems that the soul can attach to the body at any time after about 12 or 13 weeks. Once the baby develops a voltage and its brain starts to operate, the minus 5 volts of the baby attracts plus 5 volts from God. So God was 1,000,000, and he went down to 900,000 volts, but of course he still hasn't grown. We haven't got to the end of the story yet. But then another 5 volts is ripped off God, so now he's 899,995 volts, because he's lost a 5-volt bubble of energy which has attached to the baby in the womb. So now the baby in the womb is minus 5 volts, which is the devil. That's the body of the baby. And inside the baby, attached to the baby, is plus 5 volts of God. The plus and the minus cancel out, so the baby is 0 volts. But the baby is half God and half devil. and it's a certain voltage inside. Now, when the baby is born, there are certain, it fits in with the rules of the physical universe. Now, there are certain dimensions in the universe. For example, human beings have a physical body, which is the body we see in front of us. We have an intellectual body, which is the brain. We have an emotional body, which is the heart. And we have a spiritual body, which is the soul. And these four different bodies operate under different circumstances. For example, in the physical world, if I have a pound and you have a pound and we exchange them, we both finish it with a pound. But and it seems, therefore, in the physical world that we can't get something for nothing. But in the intellectual world, for example, if I have an idea and you have an idea and we exchange them, then I finish it with two ideas and it doesn't cost anything. And you finish it with two ideas and it doesn't cost anything. Now, if we take this one step further, it seems to be in the emotional world that if I love you, my soul voltage inside my body goes up from 5 volts to maybe 10 volts or 15 volts. So when my body dies, the 15 volts goes back to God in heaven, it's attracted back to God, and God has grown by 15 volts, but don't forget he sent 5 volts down in the beginning. So God actually makes a net gain of 10 volts. So God goes up to 900,010 volts. And in this way, God grows, and God is good, so we have more goodness in the universe. And this is why we live. This is why mankind live. Mankind is a conduit for the evolution, or the growth, not really the evolution, but the growth of God. And it's not just man. If we look at the Mayas and what the Mayas of Central America teaches, they teach us that everything in this world is illusion. That's what the word Maya means. It comes from an ancient Indian Sanskrit word from around 20,000 years ago. It means illusion. And what the Maya believed was that everything you see around you is not how it appears. It's actually God in disguise. In other words, if you take a flower at one moment in time, like a beautiful rose, it looks like a rose, it feels like a rose, and it smells like a rose. In fact, it's actually a collection of biological cells, which is alive and it's growing. When it was created, the biological voltage of the rose sucked down a biological voltage from God. So the rose has a systemic biological voltage, and it has a spiritual voltage inside itself. It has God inside it. But a few weeks later, the rose will die and perish, and the voltage, the systemic voltage will disappear, the minus voltage, which releases the positive voltage of God. Now, that positive voltage is not enough to get to heaven. It might only be a quarter of a volt. So that quarter of a volt will leave the rose bush, and it will attach to another collection of living cells of a quarter of a volt, perhaps a developing worm or a butterfly. So what was a rose today will become a worm or a butterfly tomorrow. So everything we see is illusion. Everything we see is God in disguise. Now, when we examine the decoded treasures of the Mayas, they tell us that all of the religious leaders were the same incarnation, different incarnations of the same spiritual energy. For example, Krishna of the Hindu, who was born 5,000 years ago, reincarnated several times. The most recent time was Buddha, who was born in Ceylon and India, who born in Ceylon and taught in India and Ceylon. Now, Krishna means Christos, which is the anointed one, which is the same name as Jesus, basically, Christos or Christ, and Krishna. And then if we look at Buddha, his most recent reincarnation, Buddha's mother was called Maya, in other words, illusion. So we have a connection there. Now, Krishna, when he died, also reincarnated as Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun means the Son of God. And of course, Jesus Christ was known as the Son of God. And Jesus Christ, if we look at phonetically what was said in the manger, supposedly in history, when the angel came down and said to Mary, "You will have a child and he shall be called Jesus." He didn't write it down. It was spoken. Now, it seems that the etymological derivation of the expression Jesus is actually chi, C-H-I, chi, Zeus, Z-E-U-S. Now, chi Zeus, chi is Tibetan energy, which means godly energy. And Zeus was the highest of gods in Greece and the Roman Empire at the time Jesus was born. So Chi Zeus means the son of God, just like Tutankhamun. After Tutankhamun, who was the son of God, who taught the Egyptians about sunshine and sun worship and how the sun affects us, we can move forward to about 5000 BC, and we come to a character named the King of Hochdorf in Germany. And he was the Celtic king who taught the Celtic people about the sunspot cycle. And this is why the Celtic cross, the circle with a cross in it, is a representation of the sun's magnetic fields. So the Celtic people understood the sunspot cycle like we do now, and how, as I explain it in Future Science.
Sorry, Maurice, just want to jump in there. You know, you blend in such a lovely web of science and spirituality, and I can see where your electrical engineering background, your career kind of was like a mainframe or a historical framework for you to work upon, and your astrological questioning, and that's where your derivation of thought led you. And I can almost see your journey through your books and how it's a beautiful journey you have been on, Maurice. You know, I guess I just kind of wanted to get into some of the science of future science, because that's the start of the book. You start off with the atom and gravity, and well, you actually address the problems of physics. You do it by addressing the individual problems of physics. You don't just kind of jump straight at the atom to redraw it as such. But so I guess just tell us about some of the individual problems of physics, Maurice. Why we need the new atom, basically, because this atom's not stable. It's not working for us.
Okay. I sat down and decided that I'd like to figure out gravity, because it's one of the few questions I had left after discovering how the sun affected life on Earth and the purpose of ancient civilizations, what God is, why we live, why we die. There's still this nagging question of why do objects drop to the floor? And I sat down and I thought, why is it that it's taken hundreds of years since Isaac Newton first defined gravity as the force that makes things fall to the floor, but he never understood it or explained it? What he did do was he put down the relationship between the variables, which I'll cover in a few minutes. Now, what I've noticed is, what I've learned from the Mayas, and this is the important thing, and all of the ancient civilizations, is that they taught me a way of thinking. And instead of trying to find out what's there in front of us, we need to look for what's not there. For example, if you see a parent, the parent will always see what's missing in the child rather than what's there. Indeed, this is what's made mankind so successful. When something is broken, we can see why it's broken and we fix it. We don't look for things to break. That's not the way things work.
Sure.
And one of the things I realized was that there's got to be some fundamental reason. It could be a way that we are thinking about these problems or looking at them, which would explain why we haven't discovered this, because thousands and thousands of intelligent people since Isaac Newton in the 17th century, 1687, have tried to sort out many of these problems of physics, and they've failed every time. Now, what fascinated me about the first thing I knew about Isaac Newton was that not only was he a scientist, but he was also a very spiritual person who believed in God. Albert Einstein was not just a scientist, he was a very spiritual person who believed in God.
Exactly the same, yeah.
And the Mayas, the Egyptians, the Peruvians, the Chinese, and the Celts weren't just scientists. They believed in God. So again, alarm bells started to ring here. And I began to think, well, maybe the God inside us, it's the God inside us which is the intelligence. It's not my brain. For example, if you look at a swallow flying through the branches of a tree at 100 miles an hour, it's not because it's an intelligent swallow. It's not his brain that's enabling it to fly at 100 miles an hour. It's the God inside the swallow, which is very, very intelligent, which enables the swallow to fly through the branches of the trees. So I thought, well, okay, if God is inside me, then I should be able to understand anything, because God is what's driving my brain. And I learned that if I read anything, any material at all, be it scientific, artistic, or anything else, and I didn't understand it, all I had to do was go to bed, close my eyes, and let God answer the questions. And when I woke up in the morning, I would have the answers. That's how I began to figure out this stuff. I would wake up in the early days, and I wouldn't understand what I've done when I woke up, but I would write it all down and then study it, and it would become clear in the weeks and months that followed that how what I was trying to figure out actually worked. Now, going back to this thing about why is it so many intelligent people haven't answered the question, it's because they've not had God inside them. Einstein did, he answered a few questions, and Newton did, and he answered a few questions. So I thought, well, okay, I'm well qualified to address these problems now. Now I understand what's going on. So instead of looking for what science understood, I first of all looked at what science didn't understand. And I was absolutely shocked to realize that science understands nothing. Science is very, very primitive. When we're brought up at school, we are led to believe that these people are intelligent, they go around scratching their heads and wearing white coats. But quite frankly, these are very, very primitive people. The first indicator of this is that they can't understand God, and that's why they denigrate God and anything to do with religion. But just let me, for all those people who are not acquainted with science or physics, just let me say that future science has been written for any 10-year-old. So the last thing you need to understand future science is any education into science or physics whatsoever, because it will be an impediment. Because those who have studied science and physics have been poisoned. Their minds have been poisoned. And they're very closed-minded. For example, scientists do not know why the positive charges which are in the middle of atoms don't spring apart, because positive repels positive. And of course the atom was discovered by Ernest Rutherford between about 1910 and 1918. And he described the atom he didn't understand. He drew the atom as a load of red billiard balls in the middle, those were the positive charges, and black charges orbiting them. But he didn't understand why, and we still don't understand why they don't spring apart. We don't understand why the orbiting negative electrons excuse me, don't get sucked into the positive center. We don't understand why the electrons orbit the atom in 8 different shells. And I should, before I go any further, say that all of these things are explained in future science.
And let me just add there, Maurice, you have such a beautiful collection of artwork and diagrams in future science, and it reduces these complex ideas into manageable, bite-sized chunks, and it's beautifully illustrated throughout. It's a hardback copy, and it's got full-color gloss pictures in it, and it's beautiful. It's a joy to read, to have the artwork to match it up there as well, Maurice.
And this was something I learned off the Mayas. If you wish to explain something, you've got to use pictures.
Yeah, visually is the way forward, definitely.
Visually, because love is in pictures. Love is not in equations.
Yeah.
And it's all about love, and it's all about God. Now, they also don't understand why the shells of the atoms are offset by at least 45 degrees. They don't understand why objects fall to the floor. Isaac Newton gave it the name of gravity, but he never understood how it worked, and we still don't understand why objects fall to the floor. It's explained in future science. It's very, very simple. They don't understand why a magnet sticks to the fridge door. Now, right now, listeners are going to start scratching their head and say, come on. They must understand why or how a magnet sticks to the fridge door.
They don't even like you asking the question.
Exactly. They don't understand how electricity works. And you'll say, but they must do. We have electric lights. We have televisions. We have all sorts of electrical items. How come they can get them to work if they don't understand how it works? Well, you can observe how something works and replicate it, but it doesn't mean you understand how it works. For example, we know that when an electric current moves along a wire, it produces an electric field a magnetic field around the wire. So we can use the magnetic field for a bell, a doorbell, or for a relay. But it doesn't. We don't understand where the magnetic field comes from. And again, we can go on and on with these questions in every branch of science. We do not understand any of the fundamentals of science. We don't understand why stars spiral into galaxies. We don't understand why stars cluster inside each galaxy. Now, neither do physicists, and they make things up. They say, well, there must be more gravity out there holding everything together. So let's pretend there's more planets, and let's pretend that there's more gravity. And
this is the thing I never agreed with either, Maurice, was this dark matter, and this is where you're going with this, I guess, that they made up this dark matter.
Yes, they make it up.
This magic substance.
To fit the things they don't understand. And, I see it like, it's like a dog confronted with 10 dinners, 10 platefuls of food on the floor. And the dog goes manic. As soon as you put the 10 plateful of food down, it runs from plate to plate, grabbing a mouthful of each plate, gorging itself. It doesn't know which plate to turn to first, and it's afraid to leave any plate alone in case somebody else grabs it. And this is what scientists are like. They don't understand anything. So they move on to the next best thing. Well, we don't understand how the atom is, so we'll make a doorbell instead. Well, we don't understand how a magnet works, so we'll make a relay instead. And the same thing is happening now with genetically modified foods and Frankenstein science. They haven't got a clue. If it's difficult, they drop it and run and try to get onto something simple. Now, what I found was that once I listed all of these, what I call 12 great mysteries of physics, and there's a couple of others like the sunspot cycle, global warming, and things like that, I then started to look at the problem in a different way, going back all the way to Newton and dismissing everything since Newton, basically, even dismissing all of Einstein's work and quantum theory, which is nonsense. Now,
let me just add there, Maurice, because I'm glad you brought that up just before we go on a bit. I've studied quantum physics, I had to, and basically they even tell you in university that if you think this is what Niels Bohr, the father of quantum physics, quoted, that if you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't. And this is the psychobabble that they actually preach you. And all they do is teach you mathematical equations that model it, but it doesn't explain what it is. And people think that quantum physics are the smartest guy on the planet, but all they can do, they're just mathematicians that are modeling stuff that they don't understand. And I always try and dispel this to people when they think that. Now, I'm not putting scientists down. There's good scientists out there, but they do think that this quantum physics is the be all and end all of the problems of the planet. Now, they can use quantum physics to put the tracks on mobile phones closer together to know where to exactly put them so that they don't get confused, because it's an application of quantum physics, but it's basically an application of mathematics. It still doesn't understand anything about the whole branch of quantum physics. So.
Absolutely. And you see, they can't have it both ways. They can't say they're scientists and agree with quantum physics, because quantum physics is based on probability, and probability is not a science. Probability is chance. It's all about chance. A science is specific. It has specific laws which relate to each other in specific ways for given temperatures and pressures. They do not change. You can't say, well, it might be this or there might be a 10% chance. So even if they subscribe to quantum physics, it cannot be science. It's simply speculation. As for relativity, Albert Einstein was a reincarnate, as many of us are. He'd been born many times before. And because of that, I've seen it many times with researchers. I've met many researchers, and they've brought things forward from a previous life. The Tibetans cause this knowledge. They give it the name of sanskaras, that they're brought from one life into the next life. And so you say, well, what does a sanskara look like? Well, a sanskara is an energy attached to the person when he's alive. So when the soul leaves the body and does not go to God, it can only come back to the earth, which is purgatory, or the sun, which is hellfire. So it stays on the earth, and
I wanted to get into the Higgs boson scam, because that's a recent thing that's occurred, Maurice, in in the media with their publication of this finding the God particle, like, and I believe that's a scam too. Like, I mean, I've never agreed with particle physics. I've got major reservations about a lot of things in physics, and I'm glad that your book Future Science, when I read it, like, because you dispel the myths that half of science is, Maurice.
Absolutely. The Higgs is a scam, an absolute scam. They're saying they've discovered a particle, which, now, in my view, there are only three particles: protons, electrons, and neutrons, and that's all we need to explain all of these mysteries of physics. What happened was, in 1935, because they couldn't understand the atom, they couldn't understand why the protons didn't spring apart, a researcher named Yukawa said, well, maybe they're glued together with some kind of glue. So they started looking, we're going back now to what if science. That's what I call it, what if science. What if all of these positive charges were glued together? So they said, okay, what would they be glued together with? Well, let's say it's like Velcro. But then another guy said, but what do you mean? Like, you got Velcro where one side has got velvet and the other's got a hook side. So the hook side sticks to the velvet side. Is that what you mean? And he said, yeah, it'd be like Velcro. But then another guy said, well, hang on a minute. What happens when you finish up with two positive charges covered in the velvet side? They wouldn't stick to each other. And what would happen if you had two positive charges covered in the hook side? Those two wouldn't stick together. So another guy said, well, that's true. So there must be three types of Velcro. So here we go again. And what's happened since then in 1935 is they've been looking for more than 300 different atomic particles. In fact, if you look in the Oxford Science Dictionary of this search for more particles, it says the whole elaborate theory is circumstantial. None of the small particles have ever been identified in experiments. The theory does not claim to have been verified. Now, what I've shown in Future Science is that the particles don't exist, and they're actually getting manufactured inside the particle accelerators. Now, the thinking behind this goes like this. We don't know what's inside the atom, so let's smash two of them together, break them open like boiled eggs, and examine the bits inside. That's the way of thinking we've had since 1935. So if you imagine you smash two boiled eggs together, you look at the bits inside, you say, look, some of it's yellow, some of it's white, and some of it's shell. So we must have a yolk, we must have a white, and we must have a shell in each egg. So that's the basis. So they say, well, if we smash two atoms together, it'll tell us what's inside the atom. Well, that is correct if you throw two atoms together. But they're not trying to find out the particles, the protons, the electrons, and the neutrons. They're trying to find subatomic particles. So what they're doing is smashing the particles together, the protons together. Now, when you smash a proton together, you're simply disintegrating the particles into smaller bits which have different properties. These are not subatomic particles. They're just damaged particles. They're fragments. And it's like trying to say, well, I'd like to find out how a grandfather clock works. So you smash two grandfather clocks together and you finish up with cogs and springs and things like that, wheels. And you say, well, I still can't figure out how it works, so let's smash two cogs together. So they smash two cogs together, and the teeth break off. And they say, we've found a cog particle.
Sure, Michio Kaku actually describes the particle accelerators and the exploration of subatomic particles. He likens it to dropping a piano and listening to the sound of it breaking apart to try and find out how to make a piano. And but they try to kind of mystify the whole process of what they're trying to do, but it's not science.
That's right.
You know?
Exactly.
You know, Maurice, so the gluons aren't needed, yeah?
None of those particles are needed. All we've got, the real problem is this. Since 1915, we've looked at the atom as an electrical entity, positive proton, negative electron, and a neutron made of half of a proton, half of an electron, and what they call an antineutrino, which holds them together. So there's three particles, positive, negative, neutral. The neutral one is neutral because it's half a positive, half a negative joined together. Now, the reason we don't understand how electricity works is because we don't understand how an electric current, which is the movement of electrons along a wire, creates a magnetic field. And what I've shown in future science is that half of the time the atom is magnetic and half of the time it's electric. And this is where science has gone wrong. It's viewed the atom as an electric entity when it isn't. It's electric for a fraction of a second, then it's magnetic for a fraction of a second, then it's electric for a fraction of a second and magnetic for a fraction of a second. And it oscillates in and out. And this, once we understand how the atom works, we can figure out why the atom is stable, what makes objects fall to the ground, why the magnet sticks to the fridge, how a doorbell works, and all the rest of it. Once we change our thinking ever so slightly, it's only slight change.
Is this the spiked neutrinos you're talking about, Maurice?
Spiked neutrons, yes.
Yeah, sorry, spiked neutrons.
Yeah,
it's you've cleverly redrawn it, and there was never any reason it had to be a spherical particle anyway.
Absolutely not.
You know, that was just an idea, a concept, like.
Absolutely, and there's no reason why the electron had to be a spherical particle. No reason at all. All you have to do to understand all of physics is to change the shape of the electron from a negative sign into a coil, and change the shape of the neutron from a sphere into a cylinder, or a sphere which is coil-shaped, like the continuous peel of an orange. As long as it's coil-shaped, it will work.
Sure. You know, the whole journey of from your description of the atom with the art and the diagrams right through to basically what it means for, in everyday terms, of global cooling and global warming and how gravity works and electromagnetics, and you know, it all makes so much sense to me, Maurice. This is the beauty of future science. It's from starting from the concept and going back to the drawing board. You're going back down this new journey again, and it just makes sense all the way along. You know, I can't find any fault in it, Maurice.
Thank you.
You know, that's the beauty of it. So I don't want to give too much away for the listeners, because I'm hoping they're going to read your book too. Like, and I do really endorse it, and I do really recommend it.
Well, I can say that orthodox scientists can't find anything wrong with it at all. Yet they hate it. They disagree with it.
Oh, I bet they do. I bet they do, Maurice.
If they were to agree with it, then they'd be out of a job tomorrow. You see, these people get billions of dollars and huge salaries to look for how gravity works. The last thing they want to do is find out how gravity works, because that way they'll be on the dole. So they take great care never to discover anything. This is why nobody discovers cancer. This is why nowadays 1 in 3 people get cancer, but 100 years ago 1 in 20 got cancer, because they don't want to find a cure, because they'll all be out of a job.
Sure, you know, and this is the thing, it's not a courageous field, as what you're saying, Maurice. You know, we're both from the same background, electrical engineering, and this stuff makes sense to me straight up, like, but, and like I say, you don't need to have that electrical engineering or scientific background, but, you know, we're in alternative fields, Maurice, independent research, independent science, alternative, and this is where the breakthroughs are coming from, Maurice, in this day and age. You know, people outside the academic paradigm, they're locked into this paradigm, this academic field, that they're not free to think. They have to act and be a certain way, like, and you know, I think there's more people coming into an alternative science and alternative history field now.
Absolutely, because people are demanding answers. The younger generation have got all these gadgets like mobile phones and everything, and they don't even know that nobody knows why objects fall to the ground. They think that Isaac Newton explained it. They don't understand what we don't know. And it's because we've all been brainwashed and poisoned. Our minds are poisoned by school teachers. And once they've been poisoned, you can never get your brain back on course once you've allowed it to be poisoned.
I'm glad you just mentioned that there, Maurice, because this is something that grabbed me in the book, and this is the one key thing in the book. This is what appeals to me, because Newton's had an equation for gravitation, which is basically the product of one mass by the product of another mass, and you divide it by the square of the distance between them. But the problem is, you need to multiply this by a magic number called the gravitational constant. Now, this is just the most ludicrous idea to me. I never was happy with this. Now, I was in school, and I have what they termed me at 100% logic percentile, but they had me down for Asperger's, and they had me down for ADHD, and they had me down for high latency and all these problems, like, you know. But I do have 100% logic percentile, and when I see something that doesn't agree with me, I don't like it. And I never agreed with that equation, because I was like, how can you just make up this magic number and put it in? Where are you getting that from? It doesn't make sense, like. And it never made sense to me. And there's always these key things to me throughout science that don't make sense, and I have to accept them until I go home in my own privacy and go, well, I'm not accepting that now. I had to go through school going, okay, you're telling me that's right. I'll listen to you for the time being, but I'm going to think my own thing at the end of the day. And I think that's what I took out of science, Maurice. I take what I want, and I let you say what you have to say, and and I think there's a lot more people thinking independently like that now, Maurice. I'd like to think so anyway.
Well, we have to, because, you know, people, it's like the emperor's got no clothes on, and nobody's mentioning it.
Yeah.
You've got to say, why have we made no scientific discoveries in the last 100 years? Now, this is where the imbecile scientists start jumping up and down and banging the table. The only progress we've made is in speed. 100 years ago, it took a week to cross the ocean on a sailing ship. Now we can do it in 8 hours. One day we'll be able to do it in 8 minutes, no doubt. But but it's only the technology that's changed. It's not the scientific discoveries. We are not any more capable of doing anything we couldn't do 100 years ago than we can't do today. Now you say, oh, well, medicine, look how far medicine's come. There used to be butchers and saw people's legs off. Well, there's no such thing as modern medicine. All of the medicine we use goes back to the 19th century, whether we're talking about vaccinations, whether we're talking about the cleansing of wounds with from Lister, Joseph Lister, with his Listerine and so on. Whether we're talking about anesthetics to put people to sleep so that they don't die of shock when you're sawing the leg off. So these are the reasons why modern medicine is more successful. But when you look at the 20,000 diseases in the World Health Organization list of diseases, and ask ourselves, how many diseases can modern medicine cure? You'd be surprised to hear that apart from the ones cured by antibiotics, the answer is none. Modern medicine can't cure one disease that's listed in the World Health Organization of diseases. Now, people don't understand this. We're brainwashed into believing that doctors will cure you. Doctors will not cure you. The chances are, if you go to a doctor, you'll be dead.
Yeah, I got an issue with doctors too, Maurice. I'm tuned into that one too. And my dad, I think I get that from my dad. And my dad's into alternative healing. He's a hypnotist, like, but you know, and he actually had a problem himself with his heart, and they were trying to prescribe these really bad heart tablets. I can't remember the name of them. They're really they were taken off the market quite recently. But yeah, they just want to prescribe a pill and sell the pharmaceutical drugs, like.
That's all they're into is profit making for the drug companies. And of course the drug companies, certainly in America, they sponsor all the medical schools and buy the equipment and fund the students. So when the students graduate, they're all in the pocket of the drug companies. So they prescribe drugs for molecular biological recovery and ignore the spiritual body, the intellectual body, and the emotional body. Now, of course, they're not going to cure people because we're complex creatures, and all of those different parts of our being have to be addressed for a balanced body and for pure health.
Sure. The incentive's all wrong, Maurice, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not even there, I suppose. Like, it's wrong or it's not there. It's like.
It goes for every single branch of science you look at. You look at chemistry. We can't put two hydrogen atoms together with an oxygen atom and make fresh water. We can't do it. We can't do any of the 5-year-old science that we should be able to do. We can't do. We don't understand how lightning is made inside clouds. We don't understand why cyclones happen, what causes a vortex. And they haven't got the whole field of meteorology is wrong about low pressure systems, high pressure systems, cyclones, hurricanes. It's all wrong. All of our science is wrong. It needs throwing out, and we need to start again. But we can't start again because the orthodox scientific community won't allow us to point out that everything is wrong and that there is another way of looking at it which supplies all of the answers, because they don't want to be marginalized. If you've spent 5 years doing a physics PhD, and somebody comes along and says, do you know you've just wasted 5 years of your life and $100,000 on tuition fees? You're not going to say, I do realize that, thank you for pointing it out. You'll stand your ground and you'll fight for what you've been brainwashed into. And this is the problem. And so it perpetuates. And if you don't regurgitate the drivel when it comes to exam times, then you fail your exams. So you've got to digest the nonsense in order to graduate from university. And then you have to, in order to succeed, you have to get rid of all that nonsense and go back to being a 5-year-old and start doing it all over again. Of the sun, most people think they're actually cooler regions, but they're not actually cooler regions. They're just periods of intense magnetic activity. And when light passes through them, the light is diverted, it's deflected 90 degrees. So no light comes out of the sunspot holes. They're no colder. It's just that the light doesn't get through them. So I tried to figure out a way of calculating how long this sunspot cycle takes. Now, conventional wisdom said it could not be calculated for 3 reasons. One, because the sun has 2 magnetic fields, one on the equator and one on the polar caps. And these 2 fields rotate at different rates. So it's difficult to describe the position of either of those fields in relation to the Earth. For example, we might say, well, the polar field this week is 90 degrees from the Earth, and the equatorial field is in line with the Earth. But a week later, the polar field might be 20 degrees and the Earth might be 6 degrees. So you've got 2 variables. And because of this, and because the Earth is moving, the conventional wisdom of science is that the sunspot cycle cannot be calculated. But there is a way of calculating it, which I figured out using a method I determined as differential rotation of the sun's 2 polar fields. We can do it by calculating the crossover of the 2 magnetic fields and differentiating one with respect to the other. That means finding the difference between them, and then finding the difference between that common field, or the aggregate field, and the Earth. And what I found was that there's a cycle of 11.49299 years. Then I realized one cycle, the astrological zodiac, and that the 12 personalities of our own zodiac must be related to some kind of variation in solar output every year. And so I decided to sit down and figure out how astrology works, and I figured that out in 1986. And that was after several years, probably 10 years of investigations into the sun and how it affects life on Earth. Now, most people don't appreciate or don't know that the sun actually spins on its axis, just like the Earth does. The sun takes 28 days to spin once. That is, the equatorial region of the sun takes 28 days. In relation to the moving Earth, if you were measuring it from the moving Earth. The sun is actually a ball of plasma, and it moves at a different rate from the North Pole to the equator to the South Pole. And this is known as a differential rotation of the sun. And this is caused by the planet Mercury, I later discovered on my own. Mercury moves 4.1 degrees a day as it orbits the sun, and this drags the equatorial plasma around 4.1 degrees a day faster than the polar regions of the sun. So this creates a turbulence on the sun, like a paddle, which stirs up particles inside the sun. And these particles come out of the sun, positive and negative particles come out of the sun, and the polarity changes every 7 days. So as the sun spins, it showers off 7 days of positive particles, then it showers off 7 days of negative particles, then it showers off 7 days of positive particles again, and then again 7 days of negative. And this 28-day period corresponds to the human biorhythm, which is well known, and it was discovered by others, Swiss scientists in the 1960s and 70s. What I discovered was
some of your background and your early career before you became an author and build a picture for the listeners, I think?
Yes. Well, my interest in engineering and science really began at the age of 8 when I used to keep pigeons in Manchester, where I grew up. And I couldn't figure out how the pigeons found their way home. And I remember when I used to let them go, they used to fly up into the air, circle once or twice, and then zigzag all the way home to Manchester. And I was fascinated as to how this, what they were sensing, what they were actually doing. And I had to wait until I was 20 years old, and I went to sea as a radio officer on board ship. And I was standing in the wheelhouse one day in a storm off the coast of France, watching the steering gear and the gyro compass. And I was looking at the course the ship was plotting. And every time a large wave hit the bow, it knocked us off course. Then the gyro compass would sense the magnetic error and send a signal to the rudder, and the rudder was bringing us back onto course, so that the ship steered a zigzag course. And so it occurred to me then that the pigeons who flew in a zigzag must be finding or sensing this magnetic deviation and then error correcting to get back on course. And that got me very interested in magnetism, how it affected the human brain and the body, and how the sun and the sunspot cycle affected humans on Earth. About the same time, I was interested in psychology and all kinds of things from ESP to all the paranormal type of sciences. And I decided to investigate psychology and how the brain worked and how magnetism affected the brain, and how sunspots might be instrumental in creating the 12 types of personality that we see in astrology, sun sign astrology. So I went to college for 3 years in Manchester Navy College, and I finished off at Plymouth University doing electrical and communications engineering. And I went to sea as a radio officer, and I was at sea for about 12 years, traveling the world. And I noticed that when we went to South Africa, and it was very difficult to communicate on shortwave to the UK, that the sunspot cycle was interfering with communications very badly. I also noticed that when the ship was sailing from north to south, the ship's personnel were quite happy. But when the ship started sailing from east to west, they became very anxious and fractious and started arguing. Now, the only thing that changes when we go from east to west is the Earth's magnetic field. So again, this stimulated the questions I had regarding astrology and psychology. The first trip I went on finished up in China, and it was there I went around the marketplaces and the temples and talking to all kinds of people. And it was I then learned about Chinese astrology, the 12-year cycle, in addition to the 12-monthly cycle of Western astrology. So once I started to bring all these facts together, I began to realize that clearly the 11.5-year sunspot cycle must be related in some way to the 12-year Chinese personality. It also regulates the human female menstrual cycle. So that every time the sun spins, females menstruate in accordance with the radiation coming from the sun. Now, of course, this raises several questions. One of them, for example, is why don't all females menstruate at the same time? Well, this is because the biorhythms of each female starts and stops at different times, and it all depends when they got onto the earth, when they were conceived in the womb, if you like. So I call it asynchronous synchronization, and this is explained in Future Science. So, excuse me, it was a long journey which began with fundamental questions about psychology, solar radiation, that finished up into a journey which went into the scientific side of bioregulation and fertility, hormone regulation, and personality determination. I discovered that this radiation shuffles at the genes at the moment of conception, and this causes 12 types of personality because there are 12 types of radiation every year. And then from that side, it was quite a coincidence, really, because I was walking down. Oh no, I've missed a step out. I was then working at Cranfield University from 1989 as head of electrical and communications engineering, and I looked after the electrical and communications infrastructure of the university. It was not on the academic side; it was on the management side. And one of the jobs I had to do was working with the computer center, which had one of the biggest computers in the world at that time, a batch of DEC computers. And I was trying to figure out the duration of a long-term sunspot cycle. I'd calculated the 28-day one clearly. We can observe the sunspots on the sun. They appear as dark regions of